creation.
Our monitor has come back, David.
The whole idea, that's okay. The whole idea is that if you have an isotope which has a very short half-life, and you have that very short half-life isotope in a rock which has already been theorized and proven irrefutably to have taken billions of years to form, and yet that isotope only lasts for just the length of time of the half-life of that isotope. In the case of polonium-210, it's 138 days. In the case of polonium-218, it's 3 minutes. Then you have to explain somehow in your model, not our model, not the creation model, in your model. Let's say your model is evolution. You have to somehow explain in your model, how did the polonium halos survive for hundreds of millions of years while your molten rock was cooling, and the polonium halos, the polonium that was in that rock was decayed, you know, hundreds of millions of years ago, before your rock even cooled. And so people have thought about that a little bit, and they say, well, it must mean then that there must be some other source of polonium that's feeding the radiohalo inclusion sites of these polonium halos. In fact, many people believe that, because there's essentially, if you don't believe that, there's no other way to explain polonium halos except in any other model except basically instant creation. And so people are diving on that explanation, because that's all they have for their very existence. They're diving on that, because if they can't somehow say that the polonium that formed that polonium halo was somehow derived from uranium, and by the way, uranium has a long half-life of the order of millions of years, then you're locked into a paradox. The paradox of how you have a short-lived isotope in your long-lived rock. And so there you have it. But if you believe in the creation model, it's not a problem at all. You just say, oh, it's easy. God, when he created the rock, he created the polonium isotopes in the rock, and then they started to decay after creation. And he did that to leave a record of his creation. That would be our model. And so you can actually do some scientific experiments to try to verify, you know, whether or not the polonium that caused these halos is actually primordial polonium or secondary polonium. Secondary polonium would be from uranium-238. Primordial polonium would be polonium which has no precursor, polonium that was made from the beginning. Polonium basically that you have to admit was created by God in the beginning.
Let's go ahead and show them some more of these polonium halos as you were talking about. Here's can you believe this? The Lord actually put a pair of spectacles, so to speak, in a rock, in a granite rock. What's happened is that one of those halos we just saw, many of them were actually emplaced one right after another or decayed there. So now we're looking at the spectacle halo, which no one has ever had a satisfactory explanation for, except that God created it. Here we have these two halos with the two rings, the inner ring, the outer ring, and this one now actually began. We don't have to all know the details tonight, but it's from the isotope of polonium. Polonium just
go back to that slide just for a second. You see the line going down there between to the radio center on the right there, on that right polonium-214 halo there? That is what the detractors will say. Aha, you see that little line? That's what the uranium must be flowing through to feed that polonium radio center. But, you know, the problem is that if there's uranium in that solution that's supposedly feeding that polonium inclusion site, it absolutely has to leave alpha decay tracks in its wake as it's traveling to the site. There's no way that, in other words, uranium is an alpha emitter. As it's flowing to that site, it has to leave some kind of record that it's there. So basically, the point of all the scientific papers which were published at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was to try to document the lack of evidence of uranium feeding these halo inclusion sites. So whoever you talk to that says, oh, no, the polonium halos are secondarily created, or they're secondarily made by being fed by uranium solutions going through the mica, doesn't really understand what the published papers were trying to explain. This is a very critical point. I mean, we could sit here and talk the rest of the night just about this one point. The point is that you cannot have a uranium solution feeding these sites without evidence that the uranium was there. You can't turn off the alpha decay of that uranium while it's feeding your polonium halo inclusion site. You can't do it. So there's ways to actually etch the mica with acid to actually see the alpha recoil tracks. You can actually measure the density of those alpha recoil tracks and say, you know what? If uranium is feeding these sites, then we should be able to see an increased density of alpha recoil tracks heading or feeding these polonium halo inclusions. What in fact you see is a diffuse background, a background of alpha recoil tracks which has no increased density as they go to the radiohalo centers. None. Right there in and of itself is proof that nothing else is going on. But you could, and there's lots of other questions that people have asked. They said, well, if God really wanted to prove that the Earth was created using radiohalos, why didn't he make halos from the other decay chains, the thorium decay chain, or other short-lived halos that would have really kind of put the nail in the coffin? What is your answer when they ask questions like that?
You know what? It's interesting that when we find something widely published, actually showing that indeed these particular halos form from these particular isotopes, and there's no evidence, of course, to indicate otherwise, lead isotope ratios in the centers and so forth, that indeed they can't explain it. They have no explanation for it. We say it's creation by fiat. They have no explanation for that. So what's the best way to try to divert attention away from the fact that they have to face the music, so to speak? They don't want to face the music. They don't want to say anything about the evidence. So they raise the question of what doesn't exist. In other words,
we could spend all night trying to figure out why God did it this way. Why didn't he do it this other way? Okay, well, why didn't he do it this other way? I mean, you can go on and on and on forever trying to figure out why God didn't do it another way, a way that you think would have been smarter. You're smarter than God. The fact is that why don't you just focus, or why don't we just focus on what exists and try to explain what exists? That's what we're trying to do. And I don't make any apologies, frankly, for supporting that these halos represent a rapid mineral crystallization of the granites. It's just not a hard thing for me to believe in, because I already believe in the Bible. Yeah, that helps a lot if you already have a basis in believing the Bible. If you don't believe in the Bible to begin with, what are you going to do? You're just going to be faced with some tiny piece of evidence that you can't explain any other way. But no matter what, the people that want to say that these polonium halos existed for millions of years as the uranium solutions were feeding these sites don't understand that halos can't even form in a rock that's molten anyway. So you've got so many things going wrong with the theory of trying to hold on to rocks that cool slowly over millions of years that you can't really even make a tenable theory out of it from the beginning. And so, yeah, people a lot of times come up to me and they say, you know what? I just don't understand. I just think that the Earth is really old. Life is young, but the Earth is old. But see, that doesn't make sense in our model either, because if you have the rocks with scientific evidence in the rocks of being crystallized rapidly, what do you do with geologic long ages? Long ages for the framework, the foundations of the Earth. It doesn't fit into the model. So then, these are all things that are going through my mind when people are saying, I just don't have a problem with believing that the Earth is billions of years old. I have a problem with it scientifically, not to mention biblically. We could just talk about the science of why it doesn't make sense to believe that the rocks that form the foundations of the Earth are ancient. It's just that simple. I wish it could be more complex than this, but it's really not. It's a very simple thing that we're talking about here. The way that we disprove that the halos were not formed by secondary, uranium processes, that is complex. But that's why the papers were published. They were published to leave a record that still stands to this day that has not been refuted.
David, what can I say? That's an excellent summary. Let's let the people see the other couple of polonium halos here. This one was started by an isotope of polonium with only that 3-minute half-life. And I want to pick up on what David just said. There are people who continue to say, well, no, they're not really primordial, made in the beginning, and so forth. And so, over 30 years ago, I published to the entire scientific community. I challenged them. I simply said, if you don't believe that these halos indeed were formed by God supernaturally, the only option is they had to form naturally. You have all the ingredients to go back and try to form these halos in the granites to reproduce them. I've challenged them over and over and over again for 30 years to say, if you don't believe this evidence for creation is really of God, then you should be able to reproduce it. Oh, no. They don't want to hear that. You will never find the evolutionists even mentioning the fact that they fail to actually do the very fundamental thing that science requires. If they believe a theory, and they have all the material, of course, to try to duplicate it, they should be able to do it. We're going to get into that a little bit later on, more specifically, so you'll have a better idea. Right now, as David has pointed out so clearly here, we're saying that these halos are primordial. Now, whatever, in other words, this little illustration right here, at the top we have a glass of water, we put in Alka-Seltzer, and after a minute or so, it's gone, okay? But down at the bottom, you put in the Alka-Seltzer, and if you instantly freeze the water when the bubbles are coming out, then of course the bubbles are going to be in the glass. And also the bubbles are going to be there after 100 years. In other words, for the actual radioactive particles to shoot out and have a record there in the granite rock, it has to be what? Formed simultaneously with the injection of the radioactivity in the rock. It's simply bing, 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 bing. And it's all along. Now look at this next slide. What is it? Good old El Capitan again. We're saying that these halos are in El Capitan. And so we go from there to, David?
Again,
what are the implications?
We're going back to what the Bible says, that the word of the Lord was used to speak the earth into existence. All the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake and it was done, he commanded and it stood forth. And there's really no other way to say it.
And he actually then decided for us living here today and for those in the last days who are in any way doubting the Genesis record of creation in Psalm 33, 6 and 9, he left something here to affirm scientifically what he said. That's all there is to it. Back in 1981, after I had been at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for over 10 years as a guest scientist, publishing papers on what we're talking about tonight, bringing out to the scientific community the evidence for creation, and virtually getting no refutation. The laboratory was letting me remain year after year and year after year because I was publishing these papers, not because I was publishing the papers per se, but because the papers were being published and the personnel at the laboratory could see there was no refutation. They could see these articles were being published in the world's esteemed scientific journals, and there were no evolutionists that were being able to shoot the evidence down. So I went to this trial, and over here on the left-hand corner you can see the people who came to the trial, the scientists who came to the trial for the evolutionist position, and on the right, the scientists who came to the trial for creation. What happened is, earlier, in the early part of 1981, the state of Arkansas had passed a law requiring the teaching of creation science in the public schools. The ACLU challenged that law, and I was asked to come and testify about the scientific evidence that I had been publishing. Well, my wife and I prayed about it, and if something happened to indicate that's exactly what I should do. I should go and testify. I realized, however, that in doing this, it was going to go out not just to the scientific community now, it was going out to the world. And I had a pretty good idea that the laboratory management was going to take a very dim view, because throughout the scientific community, they had, in a sense, tolerated me being there at that laboratory saying all these things about the evidence showing that indeed the earth